Okay, welcome to another edition of Rotten Reviews. Today I'm going to be taking a look at Rotten Tomatoes reviews of Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines. The reason I picked this particular movie of the Terminator franchise is because this is the movie that attempted to make Terminator into a franchise. Some can say that the Terminator franchise went downhill from here, that this was the first substandard movie. A lot of people bagged on this movie when it came out. I think in hindsight, as the years have passed, this is definitely not the worst Terminator movie. That's partly because the sequels that came after Terminator 3 were also very disappointing in their own right. And I think also with the passage of time, people realized that Terminator 3 was probably more faithful to 1 and 2 than the soft and quite jarring hard reboots that came later. Now, Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines was not directed by James Cameron. Everybody knew that going into it, and Terminator 3 was marketed full well to the public that this would not have the budget of Terminator 2, that it did not film in the Los Angeles area like Terminator 2, and Schwarzenegger was even out there in interviews talking up this Terminator movie, but yet admitting publicly that this would not replace Terminator 2. It would probably not see those highs. And it did not. Now, I guess a lot of people were highly disappointed that it didn't. Their expectations were incredibly high after Terminator 2. Terminator 2 is still considered one of the top sci-fi action movies of all time. It's on almost every list as being, if not in the first or second position, certainly in the top 5. And Terminator 3 was just a huge letdown for people that thought that, the magic would strike again. James Cameron was not at the helm. As the Terminator movies have come one after the other, Cameron has gotten further and further from the actual production, although he does put his name on them as part of the marketing. But he has no actual hand in them, and case in point, the latest Terminator movie out as of this time, which would be the Terminator Dark Fate. Cameron's name is attached pretty much in a marketing fashion only, and had no, in fact, it's been said that he never visited the set one time. I don't know if that's true, but that's the word that's out there. That's what people know at this time. So I'm going to get into the Rotten reviews, the audience reviews of Terminator 3, and as they go along, I'm going to add my commentary. So right off the bat, we have 3 stars. Not bad for story and dialogue, but casting and a lack of Sarah Connor hurts this. Well, here right off the bat, there's something interesting to discuss in that Sarah Connor wasn't featured in this, and in fact, the character of John Connor was played by Nick Stahl in this movie, and that was another thing that I think, even more than not having Sarah Connor, I think the fact that Edward Furlong wasn't in this sequel really disappointed fans. There was a lot of personal issue going on with the actor of Edward Furlong that probably prevented him from being in this no matter what the price tag. So in any case, he didn't return, and that was very disappointing. I think even more so than Sarah Connor. 3 stars, a very divisive film and a big letdown from its predecessor. I don't consider that this is a divisive film in any way. This review here was written in October of 2019, so this is recent. Divisive conjures up the image of perhaps Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Certainly not Terminator 3. I guess back in the day when this movie had been released, if you had said divisive, you would have meant that just a lot of fans were disappointed. In the 2019 sense of the word divisive, you would think that politics were involved, but there were no overt politics in this movie. I can't even find any to add at this time were I to watch it today. So no, it wasn't that it divided the fans on political issues. This was just flat out a disappointment in a lot of ways. Let's move on. 3 stars. Terminator 3 is nowhere near as good as the first 2 films in the franchise, but unlike some later installments, it is at least somewhat watchable. Well, again, you see this as we get further and further from the release date of this movie. It's considered watchable, and in fact, people in recent weeks have taken more of a liking to it, looking back on Terminator Genesis and Terminator Dark Fate. 4 stars. This movie is a blast from start to finish with its intense action sequences, the Terminator being presented with a choice, and the first female Terminator or Terminatrix in the series. It's a fun time. Too bad this was the beginning of the series' fall. Now, it's interesting that they bring up that this was the first film to feature a female Terminator. At its release time, this was in no way considered divisive. It wasn't considered as a woke move or a political move, and that wasn't a thing in regards to the criticism. If anything, sci-fi fans looked at the casting before they saw this. They saw Christina Loken, who was relatively an unknown at the time, but young sci-fi nerd fans considered her very attractive, and she was very attractive. So they had hopes that she would be some sort of sexy Terminator villain. I think that's what the movie tried to go for in a lot of ways. I think it worked in a lot of ways, but that wasn't enough to save this film. I disagree on the 4 stars. Right off the bat, I'm going to say this movie's 2.5 stars. And I'm not judging it just solely on its position after Terminator 2. I'm saying that if this weren't a Terminator movie, it would probably hit the 3-star mark with just a few tweaks. 2.5 stars, I take it down from 3 stars because while the script and the writing wasn't bad, it just didn't have the tension. They tried. Tension's a big thing for me, and since we already knew where this movie was going to go in the Terminator universe, we knew this would end going right into the opening apocalypse of the big event that started the war with the machines. We knew we would see that begin at the end of this movie, so we knew again that John Connor would have to survive to the end of this movie, and that kind of takes a lot of the tension out of it. I guess if they had written this a little more cleverly, they could have made the audience forget that John Connor has to see the end alive, but they didn't make it clever enough, and so you're about halfway, not even 2/3 into the film, and you're a little bit bored because you realize that he is going to make it to the end of this movie, and it just deflates the tension. Again, I'd give it 2.5 stars, so I disagree with anything more. I'll entertain 3 stars with enough reasoning, but for the reviews that are saying 4 stars and above, I completely disagree. I'm going to try to rip those apart here. 2.5 stars. Terrible first half of the movie is almost redeemed at the end. Claire Danes did her best to raise the bar. Well, I'll agree there. Claire Danes is a weird casting. It seemed weird to me at the time, considering the material that she had done before had nothing to do with sci-fi. I don't think it was her in any way or her performance that brought the movie down. I think it was just that the scenes with her at the beginning operating the dog shelter or the veterinarian clinic, I thought that was a little bit too dull. It was a little bit too drawn out. It took the pacing down a lot. It wasn't her performance, though, and I didn't find her dialogue cringy or anything like that. So I would say Claire Danes did a passable job. I can't fault her. 4 stars, still a real event. All Terminator movies are now in T2's shadow, but this was a worthy effort. Well, agreed. I said that at the beginning. This movie was full out in T2's shadow from the get-go. It had unrealistic expectations to live up to. It's hard to even match something that would be considered one of the top sci-fi action movies of all time. People do somewhat complain that the effects weren't carried out as well as T2, but then again, the budget on this movie wasn't the budget of T2. T2 was another James Cameron project where he put his heart and soul into the effects, just like he did every other aspect of the movie. And this movie, Even if it had had the budget, it didn't have him, and it could not have met the expectations of Terminator 2. I just don't see how it could have been possible. Um, and you can't fault the movie for that. I mean, people would fault the movie for that and say, you know, this is complete crap, and a lot of people did at the time, and they would have rated this 1 or 2 stars. I completely disagree. That's not fair. You're judging this based on whether it hit your bar that's so impossibly high that it can't be hit. So again, I disagree on 4 stars. This reviewer doesn't even say why it deserves 4 stars, so I should just discount it outright. Um, Another 4-star review here, really liked how the CGI was in this film. Well, the CGI wasn't bad. It wasn't up to T2 levels, but it wasn't bad. There wasn't anything cringy or off-putting about it, but certainly that doesn't justify the 4 stars. 3.5 stars. The film is the 3rd best in the series. I'll agree. While many familiar aspects are seen throughout, the story is missing something, being almost too comedic at times. The main antagonist of the film seems like a regression from the previous film. All the quality is there, just feels a little strange. Yeah, I'll agree with that. For me, right off the bat, when I first saw this film, and I didn't see it until it came out on DVD. But my first viewing, right off the bat, the humor rubbed me the wrong way because they tried to do a type of humor that you would find at the beginning of T2, where Arnold Schwarzenegger visited the biker bar. Well, the humor in that wasn't found by Arnold Schwarzenegger quipping, you know, the humor or doing anything comedic. The humor was found in how the bikers reacted to him and not knowing he was a machine. Now, in this film, they don't do it like that. The humor at the beginning is just presented as Arnold Schwarzenegger doing goofy comedic things in the guise of a robot trying to do goofy comedic things to people. And it just comes across a little bit cringy. And I'd say that's the one scene that sticks out for me is cringy humor-wise, is when he says "talk to the hand" and he puts his hand out at the female strip club, or I don't know, ladies' night at the strip club. That was really cringy. That's not how they did it in T2. In T2, again, it was the other characters in the bar, their reactions that made it comedic, not anything that Schwarzenegger did. So it hit me as cringy. I'll agree there. Again, I don't agree on the 3.5 stars. 1.5 stars. This movie was barely entertaining and just all around poorly done. It looked like a cheesy television show. It had a bad story. The female Terminator was not frightful or intimidating in any way. There was very little suspense, and they made Arnold's Terminator into a clown. I'll agree, Arnold's Terminator being a clown with, talk to the hand. I thought, again, the Terminator, the female Terminator might have failed being intimidating simply because she was so sexually attractive. I'm not saying they should have made her ugly. I'm just saying that particularly the scene in which she was pulled over by the police officer and she was able to inflate her bust size on demand to get out of a traffic ticket. That wasn't too cheesy, but again, it put her sexuality a little bit too high. And in the first 2 Terminators, there was certainly no sexuality at all, not between the Terminators, not between Linda Hamilton's character or even her friend at the diner. The sex appeal factor just wasn't there. It wasn't a thing, and that was kind of off-putting to see that in the film. And I don't think that was necessarily a mistake. I just think that it rubbed the audience the wrong way, looking back in hindsight. But in the production of the film, they probably wouldn't have known this. Now we can look back and see that that was probably a mistake. 3 stars. While I did enjoy this film, as a Terminator film, it was disappointing. I'll agree. As a Terminator film, I wouldn't give it 3 stars. I give it 2.5. Standalone sci-fi movie. If it had a little bit more originality in sections, I would have given it 3 stars, no problem. 2.5 stars. It has some good scenes, but overall, it doesn't deliver what you expect from a Terminator movie. Agree. And that's right at 2.5 stars. So I'll agree with that one right there. Half a star. Why? This is a parody of T2. Please call it Scary Movie X. No, I disagree. It's not a parody of T2. It attempts the same type of story, just switching up the type of Terminator. I don't consider it a parody, and I wouldn't give this half a star. That's completely unfair. Now, I'm judging this review on the what the cultural impact of this movie is in 2019. I think it's unfair today to give this half a star. Now, if I were reading this review and it said July 4th, 2004, that would be a different story. This would be probably considered a more reasonable review and more representative of what people thought. But over the years, people realized this isn't the worst of Terminator by a long shot. 2.5 stars. Twists and Arnold may sustain some viewers, but the fact the main character is a hobo while the other one whines most of the movie make this a noticeable drop from the second film. Okay, they're referring to the very opening of this movie, in which it is shown that the character of John Connor is basically living the life of a hobo, tossing beer bottles into a creek. There was a clever part that kind of transitioned into a scene from the future war, with, you know, tossing that beer bottle into the creek. I liked that. But yeah, it was a letdown to fans that expected to see more of the, you know, action hero. They wanted to see, you know, that John Connor had grown up, was a little bit older, and was tougher and wiser, and perhaps closer to being that heroic warrior. But they didn't see that. They just saw John Connor that could have been a junkie that had given up on everything. And that was a little disappointing. I don't think that was a mistake. They could have pulled it back from that and shown him in a character arc changing into more of a warrior, but they didn't, and it's kind of off-putting. 3 stars. Some real exciting parts, and some of it was lame in delivery. There was too many jokes in it, plus everyone who liked the angsty John now has to deal with him older and more of a wimp. Yeah, the action was riveting, the pieces mainly worked, and the conclusion was, in a word, riveting, but there wasn't anything worthwhile story mode. People came back from the future, robots fight one another, some obstacles with what was and what is. It just seemed too on the nose worthwhile, but as a film, I think what they're saying is, as a film by itself, it's worth 3 stars, and I would agree with that. 3.5 stars. Not fantastic, but at least it has moments you can take it seriously. I agree, a lot of it you can take it seriously, and I found that going into the last act of it, it had sucked me in a lot, and I was looking forward to finding out where they were going to go at the end. And again, spoilers, that became very disappointing, and it almost became disappointing to the characters when they found out where they were going at the end. Their disappointment was actually matched by mine, and I think by a lot of people. 3 stars. Definitely not as good as the first two, but it's still a welcome addition to the Terminator franchise. I kind of agree, because I think this is the ending of Terminator, the franchise, the original franchise that was set in the modern world. I consider it a fine ending to that, because we knew where it had to go. We knew it had to end with the missiles flying, so to speak, and it did literally end with the missiles flying. So it ended where it should have. It's just it didn't have the tension to sweep you up like T2 did, and that was its main failing. But as far as how it was scripted and where it ended, where it began even, and where it ended, to me were just fine. It just got there a little slowly, particularly at the beginning with the animal clinic. But overall, I agree. It fits its puzzle piece in the Terminator franchise. Because remember, this is before Terminator Salvation. I consider the Terminator franchise, the original franchise, to just be in the modern world after Terminators appear and try to, you know, the first Terminator appears and tries to kill John Connor retroactively. You know, and we end with the missiles flying, and that's what the first movie basically set up, and that's what we got. 4.5 stars. The third installment of having the same sophisticated plot and the reprising of Schwarzenegger may get predictable, very predictable. The action and the new casting choice of characters had a great performance, and the action was improvised. I disagree on the stars, and I disagree that much of anything was improvised. I've seen improv, and I think that particularly Schwarzenegger is better at improv than people give him credit for. If there had been improv, I think it would have been better. I don't think there was any, though. I mean, that's my feeling. 4 stars. Even though being silly, it's still a Terminator movie. It feels like one, different from the sequels after this one. As always, Arnold giving everything with his performance. He does feel like a robot. Well, yeah, I would say he's completely in character. He didn't do anything that struck me as off. I mean, other than that little cringy talk to the hand at the beginning. He played his character fine. Even they did a good job. Now, I know this was before de-aging technology. I saw an interview with Schwarzenegger where he said it was all due to him working out again on a rigorous schedule. I don't know if I believe that, but just with the makeup and the lighting, what they had at the time, they did a good job making him seem like the old Terminator from T2. Yes, noticeably older, but not enough that it was off-putting. It was very well done in that regard. I saw pictures of Schwarzenegger taken of him, outside of film role of him at the time in 2003, and he looked like an old man, and he was in the shape of an old man. Yet in Terminator 3, they did a good job of making him look like the old Terminator. So I congratulate them on that. Would it have been perfect? Of course not, because even with the de-aging technology we have today, they can't get this perfect. But they did a good job without that technology. I'll give them that. 3 stars. Liked the movie. Did not like the actors, actresses. Yeah, that's a matter of taste. I would say Nick Stahl and Claire Danes, they rubbed me the wrong way at first too, because, I was coming off the expectations and what I had seen in Terminator 2. But it didn't take more than 20 minutes to get into both of them, because I don't think they did a bad job. They did their jobs. 5 stars. Pretty good still, but not as good as the first two. I agree, but I don't agree with the number of stars. And I've got some technical nitpicks, like some in-universe Terminator nitpicks to go over too, but I'm waiting to see if anybody brings those up in these reviews before I start pulling them out myself. 2 stars. Typical of everything that comes out these days, it sucks. Well, this is written in February of 2019, so I don't consider this fair. I mean, this wouldn't have been something that I would have considered fair back in 2004 or 2003 when this movie was fresh, so I discount that. I mean, yeah, I could see 2 stars, but the reasoning I don't agree with. 4.5 stars. I like your car, hee hee. I like all 3 Terminators. Another edge in my recliner. Well, they're saying they really like it, I guess. I don't give it 4 stars. 3 stars. Although this third installment in the Terminator franchise isn't as memorable as the 2 first entries, and it has a rehashed theme and indistinct plot, the movie succeeds thanks to some truly worthwhile action sequences, deep tension, great direction from Jonathan Mastow, and a fantastical performance. Okay, I'm going to stop the tension part. I have to stop here. Deep tension, no. It should have had deep tension, but it didn't. In fact, if they had had the right tension, it would have excused even the smaller budget and a lot of other things. But the tension just kind of went out of it. And again, I think it even has to have more tension to work than T2 did, because we already knew this had to end with the missiles flying, with John Connor being there to survive the missiles flying. So it needed to get more tension. It needed to have more tension than T2 had to pull this off, and it failed. 3 stars. Cheesy fun. Don't take it seriously. Okay. 2 stars. This movie is doing the same stupid thing all the time. It's just getting worse. Again, I think this comment's referring to the more recent Terminators, like Terminator Genesis, for example. Yeah, because every movie after this is just an attempt to make another trilogy. And that's the thing about Hollywood at this time. There's an obsession of turning every tried and true former hit movie into some kind of franchise. Most of the time this is failing, but there's also this obsession with turning them into trilogies. I don't know why they think trilogies are a thing. I think it's coming off the Star Wars theory. People think that a trilogy is easier to hit it right because you can get 3 films to fit together better. But I disagree. I think that no matter how many times they turn this into another trilogy, it's going to fail because there's nothing new. I mean, all you're doing is rebooting this by literally using the plot device of time travel to send more people and Terminators back from the past. And that's nothing new. There's every time they do it, there's less tension than before. So this is a fail. This, I don't think, was an attempt to start a new franchise. Nobody told me it was. I don't get the impression it was. It didn't end as though it was. But now, again, Terminator Genesis and Terminator Dark Fate and Terminator Salvation, they're all, each of themselves, attempts to start another 3-movie trilogy. Every one of them failed, and Dark Fate is the latest, failing as I speak at the box office. It wouldn't surprise me if yet another one comes out in 4 or 5 years attempting yet another trilogy, but it's not going to work. I guess we can just, like time travel, we can just keep making these movies for the next 30 years, and maybe there will be enough people to just buy tickets if they keep the budget low enough to keep it going. But I gave up on this already, and a lot of people have. They're not even going to see Terminator Dark Fate because we've already seen all this stuff before and done better in T2. Nobody's yet matched that. So again, I don't agree with anything more than 2.5 stars on this movie, and I'm not going to review the other ones, Terminator Genesis, for example, but you can look it up for yourself. They've got even larger negative review scores than this one does. It's going downhill. It's never going to get better, so I'm not going to waste my time doing rotten reviews on those. Consider this episode of Rotten Reviews to be my rotten review on the Terminator franchise going forward, and I think that's fair. 4 stars, 3.5 stars. I still don't believe it's worth that. This is a good popcorn movie, but that's not a good show when your elder siblings are the beloved early 90s blockbuster Terminator 2 and the artistically amazing Terminator. Compared to the high marks to the originals, this one falls short, but that's not really a bad thing. Terminator 3 has a number of impressive action sequences, including one that features 2 crashing helicopters, and in another which the T-101 and TX go at it one-on-one. But none is more impressive than the crane chase. Okay, somebody finally brought up the crane chase. I agree. That is a good chase scene. The only one problem I had with it, even on first viewing, was the kind of like the world-breaking nature of the Terminator technology. This Terminator, what they're calling the TX in Terminator 3, is kind of like a cross between the original Terminator and the T-1000 liquid metal put on top. Now that in and of itself is a great development. I think there's nothing wrong with it. There's no flaw in that. But the flaw in that crane chase is that the TX uses the liquid metal part of itself to sort of inject parts of itself into the pursuing police cars and take them over hacker style to steer them around in the chase. And at one point, the TX is controlling multiple police cars, Wi-Fi mode, so to speak, like a hacker, because some of her liquid metal parts is now injected into the computers, I guess, of those patrol cars. The only problem with that is even in 2003, those particular patrol cars, in fact, almost no car on the road had drive-by-wire technology, which is that drive-by-wire is a system in which your hands are on the steering wheel, but the steering wheel is only turning, providing electronic signal to turn the axle, to turn the wheels on the car. There's no actual physical steering column in the car. Well, this was not a feature on almost every car on the road, and no cop cars had this feature. So right off the bat, this rubbed me the wrong way as a sci-fi fan, because yes, It's not breaking Terminator canon to have the T-1000 do something like this, but it's breaking real world canon to have her able to remotely pilot and steer cars that have no remote control systems on them. There's no drive-by-wire on any of these police cars or on 99% of any of the cars that were on the road in 2003. So yes, it's possible, but this movie would have to be set several years into the future, like say in the present day, to make this work. So it's a weird case of it breaks Terminator. It doesn't break Terminator canon, but it breaks my real world suspension of disbelief. And that's kind of weird to do in a sci-fi movie, because most sci-fi movies that do this, they break the suspension of disbelief in their own logic. But this one actually does the reverse. You know, they give me the feeling that it's a good idea to do this in the Terminator movie, and at the same time they make me say, well, hey, this isn't possible in our world, even though it should be possible in the Terminator world. So it's just weird. It was off-putting, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that found problems like that. But otherwise, that was a flawless chase scene with the crane that would have worked just fine in Terminator 2. In fact, it seemed it was something that was scripted or taken from a storyboard idea out of Terminator 2. It seemed like something James Cameron would have come up with. It's just that it kind of rubbed me the wrong way with that reality-breaking drive-by-wire part. 3 stars. 62 out of 100. Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, definitely doesn't live up to its 2 predecessors, but the movie is good enough to be called worthy in the Terminator franchise. I'm sad studio still continued without the interest of James Cameron. The dip in quality is noticeable. The story is pretty good, and the ending is actually consequential, which I liked, but some of the action is definitely over the top. Overall, a pretty average but watchable movie. I disagree with a lot of this. I agree it's kind of a letdown to fans that James Cameron didn't participate after T2. But I don't agree with the action being over the top. The action in T2 was way, way, way over the top compared to this. This is, you know, remember T2 is the movie that gave us semi-trucks driving through concrete barriers and etc. It was fantastic, but it was way over the top. So there's nothing in Terminator 3 that goes over the top of what T2 did. 2.5 stars. Another 10 years have passed since Sarah and John Connor's daring fight to end Judgment Day, and Skynet has yet to drop bombs on the world. John Connor has disconnected himself from his past as best he can and lives as a vagabond in Los Angeles. As in the previous films, 2 Terminators are sent back in time, one to protect John and one to terminate him. It seems we're in for a rerun, or are we? Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines was written by, etc., etc. Well, I read all of that because it's a good recap of the plot. It's probably the last time I'm going to do that, now that I've got it in this review. Again, it doesn't explain why the 2.5 stars. I agree with the 2.5 stars. I just feel that the poster, the reviewer, should have put more in there as to why he thought it was 2.5 stars. 2 stars. The pair of Terminator films did so well because the story was meant for 2. T3 is pretty much a tedious extension of the universe, and although it's okay, most franchises have proven that when one robot creature whatever becomes many robot creatures whatever, it's just less interesting. I agree completely with that. We've seen this before, so just doing more of it with more CGI wouldn't even please anybody. Now, I disagree that this was the Terminator film. The first one was made for a sequel. It wasn't. It was made to conclude, and it concluded masterfully. It was literally a work of art. I can't argue that. Before Terminator 2 was even imagined, I had probably seen the first Terminator, maybe like 20 times. I was a high school kid when it came out, and I had it on VHS. I recorded it myself on VHS. I had a store copy on VHS. I didn't have it on DVD when DVDs came out, but as a teenager, I had watched this so many times I could probably recite the dialogue. It was a work of art. Now, when T2 came out, people were not expecting, 2 Terminators to fight each other. They weren't expecting Arnold Schwarzenegger to be the good guy or have any kind of humorous dialogue. So this was completely new, and that's why it worked. There's nothing you can do along these lines now, even adding female Terminators, for example, that's going to impress anyone. So that's why T2 worked and T3 and etc. don't. So having said that, Camera never intended for there to be two Terminators. This wasn't set up as a franchise from the beginning. And again, almost everything I see that is set up as a franchise from the beginning, no matter what the budget is, falls on its face. 2 stars. The film is practically a comedy remake of T2, but nowhere near as good as film on its own. It's not without merit, but yet shouldn't be in existence at the same time. That's fair. Then again, if this particular Terminator 3 did not exist, another film would have taken its place because people were hungry to see, how the story led up to when the missiles actually flew, and we didn't get that in T2. So some kind of Terminator 3 to end at the missiles flying was inevitable. It didn't have to be this one, but it could have been much worse. We could have had something worse than Terminator Genesis. We could have had something that had 10 times the CGI done really awfully. So I think Terminator 3 ages pretty well, and it's much better than what we could have gotten. 2.5 stars. Although very unnecessary, somewhat entertaining, I do believe that the T100 is better than the TX in some ways. It was a typical early 2000 action flick. It had boring characters, a copy and paste from T2, and a little early 2000s effects, lighting, acting, and action. I think this is just an extra paycheck for Arnie. Yeah, it was an extra paycheck for Arnie because, remember, he was just... I think he was just coming off being a politician. And that was, not being from California. I can't comment on that. But T2 is like Arnold, like kind of in half retirement. Again, I'm surprised that he did as well of a job as he did. But perhaps his personality is just suited for a character like the Terminator because... it doesn't have a lot of personality. So 2 stars. They botched this. The idea wasn't complete garbage, but execution made it sure ended up like it. This strays too far from the first movies. Christiana Loken is not very good for the part. As a grown-up, John Connor is less interesting than previous films suggested. Yeah, his character was less interesting, but again, that's not the actor. I think a lot of that is just where he had to go from point A to B in this movie. They had to take him from, the kind of mess of a kid he was, and then somehow take him to, being like this action war hero as the missiles flew. They didn't quite pull it off. They did get him from point A to B, but they didn't actually move him into the serious war type person. They kind of just dropped him there and left it to your imagination how he'll become that in the future. So it failed. But again, it could have been far worse. It could have been far worse. At least it got to where it was supposed to go. It just didn't, hook people in all the way. 5 stars. A very good movie. Better than Salvation. Jenny whatever. Black Panther, Solo Star Wars story. It just needed a little editing, but to those who saw past some of its problems, a perfect movie. I wouldn't say perfect, but it did get to perfectly where it was supposed to go. Better than Salvation, yes, because again, Salvation was supposed to be its own thing. It was supposed to take part in the post-apocalyptic world where John Connor was already an action. He was already, I keep wanting to say action hero, but he was already a war hero and a respected leader in some kind of military outfit. But we didn't get that in Salvation either. We got an older John Connor in Salvation that was like certainly war weary and a little bit battle scarred, but we didn't get a sense of why he was such a great leader or how he had gotten that way from the angsty teen that we had seen before. So that failed too. I would say T3 is much better than Genesis in that, and it's less disappointing than Genesis was. Genesis tried more callbacks even in the music to T2, and it actually rubbed people the wrong way. That's a topic for another video if we get back to Terminator. 4 stars. I actually really liked the movie. A lot of people didn't, but I thought the action was good. The writing wasn't half bad. The only problem is that they kind of stretched on an overused plot, but other than that, it was good. I kind of disagree. I don't think they stretched the plot too much and that it was overused. I think it really fell flat when Claire Danes found her character found her father as also having a pivotal role in the creation of Skynet. I thought that was a little too on the nose, a little too convenient. It didn't really destroy it for me, but it was like too many coincidences at the same time. You know, they say in fiction writing, you're allowed to start off with one crazy coincidence, but that's it. You can't just have two, three more crazy coincidences show up further down in the plot. And having Claire Danes, having her character's father somehow end up involved in the creation of Skynet was too much. You know, it's one thing she's hooked up with John Connor, fine. It's another thing that all of a sudden she's also just happens to be pivotal in the creation of this. It was too much, and it rubbed me the wrong way. 4.5 stars. Not as good as the first two movies, but it still deserves a solid 4.5 stars. I would still recommend buying, renting this movie, as it's another Terminator movie, of course. I would say no, it's not worth 4.5 stars. It may be renting or buying this if it's really cheap. It's certainly not worth spending a good deal of money to buy it, or to buy it as part of some collectible. If it's included in some kind of box set, fine. But this is definitely just a 2.5 star. It's not horrible, but it's, you know, the few memorable parts aren't really relative to Terminator. Like, in my mind, to be honest with you, the most memorable parts are Talk to the Hand, Christiana Loken's inflating her breasts, and the missile flying scene at the very end. And that's very little of what's relevant to the movie, so again, that's mostly a fail. 4 stars. A third chapter that really circles back towards the twisted inevitability and a tense revelation, while functioned as a satisfying follow-up with decent performances and slight ridiculing of the continued. Okay, this is kind of word salad that runs on. I think what they're trying to say, it's a B+, and it's a little too wordy. It's almost like it's trying to make an excuse to find 4 stars. I say no. I say 2.5 stars. Half a star. If I gave this 0 stars, will it make it so that it never happened? Who allowed this to happen? Surely somebody tried to speak out whilst waving a Terminator 2 review in the executives' faces. It's not that bad. I could see this being a review, you know, from somebody that just came out of the theater on opening night. But really, nah, this is a little hyperbolic. I don't give it half a star. 5 stars, liked it, it's kind of good, 2 stars, if you want good action and visual effects, this movie may be for you, but if you're expecting a good story, good character development, funny humor, and expect it to be an interesting follow-up from the 2 Terminator films, then you might want to skip this movie. I agree, you can skip it. You already know that it has to end with the missiles flying, so I agree that it's skippable, but I don't think it's bad. It's better than watching paint dry. 3 stars, a good film with excellent stunts and effects, a goodish follow-up to T2. Yeah, I can't fault the stunts and effects. In fact, even the Terminator effects, you know, the liquid metal hybrid with Terminator endoskeleton, that's not bad. For the time, the effects seem fine to me. I think it wasn't used to its full potential, but then again, it didn't have the budget of T2, but I can't fault it for effects. 4 stars. After 15 years of hearing people say that this movie paled in comparison to its predecessors, I thought I made the right choice never watching it. However, now that I've given it a chance, I have to say it's not bad at all. Despite what I expected, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines fits as the next piece in the ongoing story of John Connor. This movie makes a lot of references, sometimes serious and sometimes with tongue-in-cheek, to the movies that came before. It worked for me even though okay, I agree with that, not with the 4 stars. It fits in its place. It fits, if it were a puzzle piece, it fits perfectly where it's supposed to. And again, the reviewer makes the point, a lot of people were off-put by what people said about it, you know, having their expectations not met, you know, coming from Terminator 2, and they just took that to heart and they skipped watching it. I don't say it's not that bad. yeah, you're not really missing out skipping it, but it's not like to be avoided as the plague. That's over the top. 1 star. I'm a big fan of the Terminator series. I've seen 1, 2, and Salvation many, many times. This one is just horrible. The entire basis for the Terminator story is a post-apocalyptic war between humans and machines, yet somehow they try and pull this one off as a comedy. It seriously does not work. Okay, I agree. I'll stop there. I agree that he probably encountered the talk to the hand thing right at the beginning and just wanted to shut it off. I can see how that'll hit you. It'll smack you like that. By the time I thought about, that dooming it for me, it had moved past it. I had a little more patience, but I can see, okay, that would have just thrown you out of it. 3 stars, Terminator, but with breasts and an ass. Okay, that's valid, as crude as it is. There are a lot of criticisms of Christiana Loken and in a few other things she did, like on the Sci-Fi Channel. Maybe the criticism's not deserved because her sex appeal was so out there. It's like some women actresses, they are kind of in between a rock and hard place. If they weren't attractive, people would say they weren't attractive to be, they were too unattractive to be in a big movie. But if they're too attractive in the classical way or to too many people, then their acting is really bad. So I think that's unfair. I don't know what happened to her. I haven't had time to look that up. But I think it's unfair to say she was a bad actress in this. She really wasn't. Her role didn't require stellar acting, but the sex appeal, it probably turned a lot of people off. 4 stars. Without the directing of Cameron, Rise of the Machines is a good movie, even with the cornier feel, and its ending is a blast. Don't agree with the 4 stars. Some of that corniness too comes from the veterinary clinic scene. There's kind of a part where Schwarzenegger, an EMT attempts to lift the Terminator, Schwarzenegger's Terminator, kind of out of a bit of wreckage where he had been pushed into by the Terminator X, and they made kind of a humorous thing out of it where the EMT was really surprised how heavy he was and couldn't move him. It was little stuff like that rubbed some people the wrong way. I didn't find it off-putting, but a lot of people did. 1 star. Why do Muppet directors take on projects that are way out of their depth? Plot hole from 5 minutes in, with Connor being 13 years old in T2 when he was only 10. Pathetic investigation work and awful writing throughout. Not a Terminator movie, just awful PG script and terrible writing. If that's true, then yes, that would be a plot hole. I am not aware that they said he was 13 during T2 and he was only 10. That doesn't sound right to me because T2, he comes across as 13, does not come across as 10. I know I was 10. I know 10-year-olds now. So I don't know if that's true at all. I don't know where that information comes from. 1 star, I think, is a little harsh. 2.5 stars. Fun and dumb. Arnold is comedic gold as usual. Okay. 2 stars. The movie opens with an introduction to the enemy Terminator, played by Christiana Loken, whose performance is really good, and the character's abilities are a real standout, one of the best aspects of the movie. In fact, it also has Arnold's intro open with an unnecessary comedy moment, which isn't the right tone for a Terminator movie, and that's where lies the issue. The tone of this movie isn't as dark or as violent as the previous movies. There are killing scenes, however. Okay. Yeah, again, it's the talk to the hand part at the beginning. Yeah, it really kicked people in the balls, so to speak, slapped them in the face, whatever you want to say. That's what made it hard for people to just get into it. Yeah, I understand. 1.5 stars. To get this out of the way, I was never happy they were making this film, and it got worse when Cameron dropped out and Hamilton dropped out. I do not like this film, and it is not because it is the worst film ever, but a film that followed T2 should have been better. You have to judge a sequel on how it measures up, and this film did not. As a generic action film for casual fans who do not care about T1 or T2, you could find some enjoyment, but compared to what came before, this film is anemic. I'll agree with most all of that. 1.5 stars, okay. It's subjective, right? I mean, there's wiggle room. Yeah, Okay. That's all I can say on that. 5 stars. Easily my favorite of all the Terminator movies. The end of the world is happening at 6:18 p.m. today. That's right, today. Well, let's see. December 16th, 2017 is when this review was written. He may be correct. Not sometime in the distant future. Assuming the seemingly endless attempts to weasel out of it aren't successful, grab the guns. The shit's going down right now. If I could have changed anything about the movie, though, it would have been the car chase scene. It should have been a lot shorter. It really didn't advance the story in any way, and it just seemed to go on forever. Yeah, I'll agree with the car chase scene. It was good, as I've said, and it could have worked in T2, and it might have been just something thrown in there to recapture the nostalgia of T2. For me, it was okay, though. It didn't seem to drag, but who knows? That's the first opinion I've seen that criticized that scene, but okay. 2.5 stars. Terminator 3 has decent action and effects, and it also has its moments, such as the ending that is the reason why this movie has 2.5 stars. However, much of the entertainment value that came out of the first two movies is lost. Arnold doesn't feel quite as convincing as he was in the first two films. Also, Mr. Director, who isn't James Cameron, why couldn't you cast the kid from the T2 to play John Connor? That movie was released in 1991. This movie was released in 2003. You had no excuse. Actually, from what I've read, they couldn't get Edward Furlong. That's more like a thing going on with Edward Furlong than something going on with this film. Because again, being that this is a Terminator movie, it involves time travel, and you could plausibly set it. You could have set it in any time period. You could have fudged it around to make up for his age. No, I don't fault the movie for that. I think, yeah, everybody wanted to see John Connor. You know, they wanted Edward Furlong back as John Connor, but that just wasn't in the cards, and that's on Edward Furlong from what I've read. 3.5 stars. It fails to reach the high bar of the first two films, but T3 is criminally underrated. The direction and dialogue aren't great, and the acting could be better. Nick Stahl isn't particularly good as John Connor, but Claire Danes is pretty good as Kate Brewster. Arnold Schwarzenegger is once again the perfect Terminator, and Kristanna Loken is surprisingly great as the TX. The story isn't great, but the action and special effects are awesome, making that this a more than adequate entry in the franchise. I agree, it's underrated, not criminally, and I don't agree with the 3.5 stars. 2 stars, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, full of action but lacks the heart of the original films that feels pointless. Yeah, it feels like it lacks the heart, and I think that's because it lacks the tension. To feel relevant, to hook people, it had to deliver a hell of a lot of tension because we already knew it had to end with the missiles flying, okay? 3.5 stars. The best of the first two films, sort of. While it did have some story elements from Terminator 2, especially the overall concept seemed to stand out pretty nicely from my view, some of the action moments were pretty corny, but exceptional computer effects. Not the best film in a popular series, but probably still better than the future Terminator films after this one. Yes, everybody out there agrees with that. This isn't the worst Terminator film. That goes, according to Rotten Tomatoes, the worst Terminator award at this time goes to Terminator Genisys. It didn't strike me as being that bad. I kind of liked the nostalgia callbacks, melding it with events from the first movie, but that's not the consensus. Most people really hated it. And I don't even think the Dark Fate movie, which is coming out this week, is going to do worse. It may bore people because it's more of the same, but Terminator Genisys will probably continue going forward to be the worst from a fan point of view. 2 stars, full of action and special effects, but lacks the heart and story of the originals while being a useless sequel. I wouldn't call it useless. We were going to get something leading up to the missiles flying, so it could have been worse. 3.5 stars. Although the story has gotten familiar and nothing will match the first Terminator movies, this is an enjoyable entry into the series. Again, I agree. Nothing's going to match the first two. Even the second one didn't match the first one in a lot of ways. The second one was a different type of story. The second one was a straight-up action sci-fi. heavy emphasis on the action and the science fiction CGI effects. That's not what the first one delivered. The first one was more of a drama. The first one had a love story. The first one was more of a mood piece. It had more emotion, really, than the second one. You can argue that the second one had a lot of emotion. You know, when Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator was lowered into the molten steel at the end. But other than that, the first one was a lot more emotional. It was a lot edgier, and it had a much smaller budget. So I think it got a lot more care. It got a lot more love, as they say. But they were completely different movies. And this third one is trying to, it's trying to live up to the second one, and nothing's going to do that. 1.5 stars, terrible Terminator movie. 2 stars, the absence of Cameron is made all too evident in this vastly inferior sequel. This is where the series' trajectory started going off course. Again, I agree. This is where the trilogy ends. This is where the franchise actually ends. The absence of Cameron, people keep saying the absence of Cameron as though it's some sort of betrayal to the fans, but it's not. I think James Cameron seems to be the type of director who, when he's got something that he cares about, when he's passionate about something, he sticks with it. It doesn't matter if it's 1 movie or 4, he's going to stick with it for better or worse. And he had told everything he wanted to tell. He put all his passion out. At the end of T2, that was what he had in there, and that's what he delivered. And he didn't hold back. He didn't hold back in any way. And then he had no interest. He didn't have anything more to say on the subject of Terminator, and that this is clearly evident from the movies that have him attached as, a marketing ploy. That's the best he's going to do because his heart just isn't in it. I don't think you could convince Cameron to to take control and do another Terminator movie, because these stories that were inside of him, he's already told them, and he's not interested anymore. That's it. I mean, that's why he hasn't done a Titanic 2. If you think about it, just looking at box office numbers and cultural impact, despite the fact that I abhor Titanic, it's boring to me. I don't have the slightest interest in it. That's not the consensus in our culture. And if it were just a numbers game, Cameron should have been out there making a sequel to Titanic, as crazy as that sounds. But no, he said what he wanted to say. He showed what he wanted to show. He took everything that was inside of him and he put it out there in the film, and it worked for most everybody. Didn't work for me, but it worked for everybody else out there. And he'll never go back to it because he had his say, right? And that's the way he is. So don't ever expect him to come back to Terminator. I never would. If you watch the first movie, hey, I was surprised he even came back to do Terminator 2. But he did, and I'm glad he did. 3.5 stars. Well, not as good as the previous installment. Terminator 3 still provides tons of action, a slight bit of humor, and excellent sound design. Recommended. I don't know if I'd recommend or not recommend. I'd say just watch it if you come across it. Tons of action, no. Because you're going to find it not living up to T2. This is more like, do you want to see how John Connor gets to the point where the missiles are flying? Well, here's how he got there. Not action-packed. I wouldn't call it that. 3 stars. Though packed with great car chases, new elements, and some good actions, Terminator 3 is pulled down by its disappointing last fight and plots that are beyond my grasp. I'll agree with the last fight. It was designed to be a climactic thing, your standard action climax, but it didn't quite work, I guess, because we were just, by the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator had the battle with the TX at the very end, in the Doomsday bunker behind the blast door. It was reminiscent. They tried to make it reminiscent of the first Terminator, where Linda Hamilton crushed the Terminator in the Crusher, and so the this Terminator is crushed under the blast door in the same fashion. But it doesn't work because we've seen this before, and you could actually feel what they were trying to do, and that kind of took you out of the realism. It ruined it. So it was a little too on the nose and predictable for me. And, the real letdown, of course, is when they just left you in the bunker and the missiles were flying. And the letdown was because, You didn't see a change in John Connor. John Connor was the same person he was at the beginning of the movie. He had no real arc, so you didn't get to see him change in any way. And Kate Brewster, his future wife, even if she had changed somewhat, it wasn't relevant because this wasn't her story. So it was just disappointing. It was a wasted opportunity to show him becoming something else, if you will. Again, it ended where it was supposed to. 2 stars, so much potential, but it just doesn't compute. 5 stars. Why rated so low? I liked it so much. Rated so low mainly because it let people down from T2, and also, like I said, the ending felt disappointing. 5 stars. I personally love T3, just as good as T1. Awesome action sequences. Some of the action scenes are the best of the franchise. It was very, okay, I'll disagree. No, T2 wins and all of that. This person is saying, this person's acting like they never saw T2, and that's not fair either. I'm not saying it's fair to expect it to live up to that, but it's not fair to just ignore that T2 ever happened. No, I disagree. Not 5 stars. 2 stars. Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, takes the series in a new direction that sometimes works, but largely is removed from the magic of the first two. Yeah, I'll agree. In fact, I think it ended exactly where it was supposed to, but the magic is gone. 2.5 stars. 12 years of waiting, and this was the result. This film was pretty bad, not to mention really short. I didn't see that it was too short. In fact, because of the drawn out parts of the front of it, I think it was actually, it felt like it was a little too long. That's a pacing thing. Pretty bad, no. It's almost passable as a movie on its own. 2.5 stars, not awful, but good, okay. 0.5 star, worst of saga, a Sarah Connor death, a coward John, stupid cliches of old girlfriend. Again, I will agree with the coward John. John started off kind of a coward and he ended as one. Nothing changed. Again, that's no character arc, 3 stars, one of the best chase scenes ever. Debatable. 4.5 stars. It isn't as good as T2. However, it is a fun popcorn action movie that becomes way more entertaining than the first Terminator ever was. Well, it definitely has more action by today's standards, more, non-stop action. The first Terminator wasn't designed to be a non-stop action movie. It was a love story. It was more of a dark sci-fi, Harlan Ellison type thing. It was not just a straight-up action movie, so that's an unfair comparison. Now, it continues. The story is a lazy ripoff of T2. Okay, now that I agree with, it's like a rehash of the T2 situation, but we had seen that before. So again, even if it had had the same budget, it wouldn't have been as impressive, and it did not have the same budget. In fact, Schwarzenegger talked up the fact that they had moved a lot of the shooting to Canada because they didn't have the budget. So, lack of budget, and we had seen this before. 3 stars. This Terminator movie was also pretty great. It wasn't the best. T2 definitely was the peak before T3. However, it still brought a brand new, great action-packed storyline to watch. I still love it. It's passable. 5 stars. I think this is underrated and overshadowed by its predecessors. It might not have the incredible storytelling of T2, but for me, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, it's overshadowed, I'll agree. It's a great movie to watch. It's passable. 3 stars. While it doesn't match neither the first movie or the second movie for sure, it still delivers some fine action sequences as well as an ending that makes you want to watch the next movies. Overall, Terminator 3 ain't great, but it's still a welcome entry. Kind of agree. 5 stars. Great movie. It isn't great to be 5 stars. I mean, this certainly isn't that great. 2 stars. Why does this film exist? Crappy effects, a useless female character, and cheesy everything. Don't bother with this film. It adds nothing to the series beyond the first 30 minutes. I disagree. I think the first 30 minutes are actually not as great as the rest of it. They could have set it in a different place. I mean, I don't mind the Catherine Brewster stuff and, the TX hunting for Catherine Brewster and the other characters that would later become the lieutenants of John Connor. I thought that was interesting, but I thought the animal clinic stuff really bogged it down. It should have gone somewhere else. 4 stars, tongue-in-cheek, threequel, although lacking the real menace of the first two. This one is more family friendly and more enjoyable. Yeah, they say more family friendly because maybe it has something to do with the rating. Or it could be budget, but yeah, you don't see a lot of blood or anything like that. Again, Terminator T2 was not an R-rated movie, and I can't recall actual blood. I mean, beyond like the smallest trickle. So I don't know about that. 2 stars, awful movie. It's so bad I just can't understand why it has so high rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I wouldn't say it has a high rating, but anyway, the only worse movie than this is the 5th installment of this franchise. Kristanna Loken is very hot in this film, though. The only big plus of the movie. I think movie-wise, it actually worked against the movie. I've discussed that earlier. 3 stars. While the story is lacking in this film, it still has enough special effects and action to keep the audience interested. Yes and no. 3 stars. This movie was bad compared to Terminator 1 and 2. I was excited to watch this movie, but after its completion, I realized it was just a money grab so they could have more Terminators. I didn't get that feeling because it didn't seem to end. It's not like one of the other Terminator films. It didn't seem to end as though it were designed to create sequels or to create another trilogy. I disagree on that. This seemed like it was designed to end and be the end. Cash grab, that's why I don't agree it was a cash grab. I think really they thought it was going to be a worthy piece to end with the missiles flying, and it just disappointed. 4 stars, not as good as T2. It still has some great action set pieces and fantastic visuals. It also has Arnie as a bonus. Well, if you just want to see Arnold as the Terminator, it's okay. But no, to me, rewatching Terminator 2 or even the first one again is better. If you just want to see Arnold, just watch one of the other ones again. 3 stars. Terminator 3 shows you what happens when James Cameron makes 2 great movies and then they hire someone else to do the third one. Kind of agree. 4.5 stars. The 3rd installment of Terminator was a great movie. I loved this film a lot because they gave us a female villain that was badass throughout the movie. I recommend checking this movie out because it won't disappoint. I disagree on the badass. I mean, any man or woman put into the role of the Terminator is going to come across as a badass. That's just the nature of the role. So, no. 4 stars. Terminator 3 is not as good as the first 2, but is still one of the better action films to date. This film is very entertaining, thrilling, and just no, I agree, you're giving it a little too much. 2 stars. The film cannot compare at all to the first 2. From the arrival scene to the action and suspense, it's all done wrong. Clearly the best part is the TX arrival. Well, if you mean she looks good arriving, I'll give you that. 3.5 stars. The film was all right, not great. While the plot is more or less recycling T2, we got to see more of John Connor before Judgment Day, and we got to see the world end. I'm glad they ended it with a feeling of hopelessness. Now, I'll agree with that. I think it ended the right way, but it just didn't show John Connor changing into anything. He was just as miserable at the end as he was at the beginning. I think that's why it was so disappointing. 2.5 stars. Meh, this movie was mediocre at best. I agree. 5 stars. I enjoyed this, even though it is a different director and a step down from T2. I think it is fun, action-packed, and worth checking out. I agree, but not 5 stars. 1.5 stars. I just did not like this movie. The plot wasn't great, and the action wasn't as great as the first 2 movies. It's not as bad as the 5th movie, but it's still bad. I just dislike this movie. It isn't good. Again, I agree, and here you again see people comparing this to Terminator Genesis. Genesis gets a lot of hate. 3 stars. A decent addition to the franchise, but never reaches the emotional depths of the first 2. James Cameron is sorely missed at the helm. Yeah, he is, but again, you're not going to see him return. He's said what he has to say on this. He's done what he had to do. He performed flawlessly doing it, and that's it. He's not coming back. 3.5 stars. On a second thought, after Salvation and Genesis, I do enjoy this movie. Again, Genesis. I'm probably going to call this one because I don't see that I'm going to find anything new to add. And if we revisit Terminator, it might be because there's another one that's going to come out that's going to be so bad that it is going to force me out of retirement to do more rotten reviews. and that will be enjoyable. But until then, I will see you on the next Rotten Reviews.